We're so excited to have you guys here today, and I'm going to start off by introducing our guest speaker. So I'm going to start off by reading his bio. Okay. So Dr. Shane McCarty is an organizational developmental psychologist who is co-creating a culture of more care and less harm. He is a co-founder of the nonprofit organization Promote Care and Prevent Harm, which conducts research on how power relates to care harm, develops training programs, and consults for organizations on how to leverage promotion/prevention science towards safety, relationships, mental wellness, and peace behaviors. Shane has trained youth to shift their school culture across the US, including after a school shooting, school-based law enforcement on implicit bias to end the school to prison pipelines for students of color in the Baltimore City schools, and healthcare professionals to address health inequities on the US-Mexico border. Shane is committed to building a culture of care, a peace economy, and the next generation of youth leaders through a COVID-19 safety corps. And, without further ado, we're going to pass him, the host.
Well, thank you all so much. I have to start by just saying how incredibly grateful I am for the chance to be with you. I know that there are many things that you could be doing on a Saturday during this collective crisis of COVID-19. And I think before I start, I do want to just say a few words to say this is an unprecedented time. This has never happened like what we're experiencing right now. And so I do want folks to remember that in this moment right now and how we're all feeling, every emotion that you're feeling, positive and negative, is normal. Senses of anger, frustration, depression, resentment, maybe moments of joy and gratitude for the positive moments that we always took maybe for granted. There's a lot that we're experiencing right now. And I think if we're going to be the peace leaders that you all are, and I'm so proud of what you're trying to do and where you're taking this world and the work that we do, it is about taking a moment to recognize that nothing will be like this again. And that's why it's even more important that for the 35, 40 of us that are with each other here today, that we take this moment towards the collective action that I know we are all capable of. So is my screen shared? Are you able to see that? Okay, great. So we'll get started. The presentation today is really about 13 years worth of research and thinking on this journey of trying to figure out how to cultivate a culture where we can promote peace and prevent violence. So we're going to talk about peace in the form of actions, in the form of systems, and then also the incredible work that you all are doing. In terms of my evolution, I really don't like talking about me. I really believe that there is little to say about me and more to say about the systems and the privileges that I have been embedded within. But I will say a few quick things. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia. I went to Tuckahoe Elementary School, and then Swanson for middle school, St. Agnes for some of my middle school, Yorktown High School in Arlington, and then I spent 9 years at Virginia Tech. I went to Virginia Tech immediately after the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007 and did my undergrad, master's, and PhD there, and ended up shifting my life towards figuring out how we could promote peace and prevent violence. And through my evolution as someone who's still evolving to be a leader, I've been involved in 3 different organizations that have evolved over time, and you'll hear some of those stories throughout this journey as well. You heard it beautifully earlier, but in terms of my personal mission, it really is to shift power towards young people who are going to build the next generation of peace leadership so that we can build a culture of more peace and less violence. We've got to build a peace economy. If there's anything that I've learned along this journey is that it's not enough to do kind moments of peace. While we all need to do that as much as we can every day, we've got to create jobs of peace. We have got to create an economy where the kindness that we share with each other is valued as much as any tangible exchange of a product, a good, or a service. We've got to build a culture where justice is no longer needed, where things are fair, where equality is reached. And I think we've got a long way to go. And I'll tell you a little bit about the incredible opportunities that I've had and how I think, been fortunate to work with incredible people who've been focused on peace, a peace journey as well. So in terms of some quick highlights, I've worked on things like implicit bias and policing, as you heard, worked with schools across the US and helping students shift their own school climate and culture. We've worked with some pretty incredible organizations, and we've got a few more in the pipeline here pretty soon. And looking forward, hopefully, to working with you all as you keep building your infrastructure and vision. Um, we're building right now a COVID-19 safety core, and I'll end the presentation talking about where there might be an opportunity for some of you to join us in doing that work as well. And so I do want to start, and I want to open up the chat for a second. Because my screen's full, I won't be able to see your responses, but hopefully a few folks that are leaders could take a peek at what is being said. I just want you to write in the chat how you're feeling right now. If everyone can just take a moment and write how you're feeling and try to be specific. You know, one of the things that we know about mental health is that the good, the bad, the I'm feeling down, the more descriptive that we can be, the more nuanced, the more specific we can be, the better we are at being able to identify our own emotions and our own feelings. And so I would just ask that you do that. I know we're all busy, we're all very productive people, and that's important. But what I've also learned on this journey is that if you don't build in the time for people to talk about their needs, moments of inequity, the aspirations and goals that they have, then you might be talking on two different planes. And a lot of good peace building work is bringing folks together to really try to understand what everybody ultimately is feeling and is thinking. And I was able to access the chat, so I can read a few quick things. You know, we're seeing everything from folks who are feeling frozen and unmotivated, overwhelmed. Let's talk about that very quickly. You should be feeling those feelings. What I want folks to understand, and we're going to talk about this as we talk about peace and the structures that lead to that, your mindset is more about the things that are happening in your environment than they are about any indication of you. And often what we do in our culture is we say to people, you aren't resilient, or you aren't tough enough, or there's something wrong with you in the way that you're thinking. And that's the wrong frame. The frame is, how is it that in this moment in 2020, with the amount of technology, with the amount of resources that our nation has, with the global connectivity of the world, how is it that in this moment, a single virus could literally stop our entire economy? That it could freeze everybody in a state of trauma? And these are the kind of questions that we're going to have to ask as peace leaders to create this new generation of peace and health and safety. I'm seeing some other things too. You know, sleepy, bored, a strange set of other emotions as well, overwhelmed. Again, all of these things are things that I'm feeling as well. I've got an incredible team with me, and we are all feeling the pressure of how to contribute to our community, and also just wake up every day and try to figure out how to get out of bed and feel like things are going to get better. Time is relative. Great point from Daniel. You know, it's really weird to not be able to move into different environments, to engage with people face to face. None of this is normal. And one of the things that I think we all need to be mindful of is how we can create routines for ourselves to make sure that at 9 o'clock you're doing this, at noon you're doing that, at 5 o'clock you're taking time to check in, at 7 o'clock you're watching a movie. Whatever it is that's going to bring you some joy and some peace, I think will help. And also to find more ways where you feel like you can be a contributor. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do right now. I'd also like you to practice thinking about the terms of, what do you need? And are you communicating to other people and your friends and your family in a way where you talk about what you need as opposed to reacting with maybe some moments of frustration? I think we've all done that. I can feel that with my own household environment right now, where despite being this peaceful person and ideally eventually a peace leader, I'm frustrated too. I'm angry. I'm depressed about what is happening, and that these are all emotions that I'm feeling and states that I'm going through. And being able to say, you know what, my need right now is to be able to be outside and to be able to take a walk and to not read, to not have a conversation, to not be in front of a screen. And so that's the behavior that I'm going to go do. My need right now is to connect with someone I haven't connected with. And so connection is my goal. And I'm going to spend energy thinking about, is really swiping online and scrolling on Instagram, is that giving me the sense of need fulfillment of connection that I'm looking for? Or is it what's also just passing the time, making me more anxious, making me more depressed? So just thinking about, what are the behaviors I'm doing, and is it accomplishing the goals that I want? And then, are you asking on a regular basis, how can I meet your needs? So things for you to think about. In this presentation, I know that you all have many things you're thinking about. And I would love if you've got a notepad in front of you or scrap paper or what have you, just to take a pen, take a good old fashioned piece of paper, and maybe just make some notes as we go through this presentation. One of the things that we also know is that the more that we can reflect and integrate on the different things that we're learning about and bring these ideas together towards your personal mission, the more valuable things will feel. There's a lot of goals that we have in the world, but right now, your vision as an organization and as a team right now is to figure out how to build peace. And I'm going to talk to you about my own peace journey. Some of these things might resonate with you, they might make sense, they might be useful, and some of them will not. But my hope is that some ideas will. And so I'd ask you just to maybe take some notes, maybe to doodle if you like to do that, maybe to mind map. You could draw circles and put concepts in, whatever is going to be a good form of a reflection for you as we go through this process together. Beautiful. So in terms of a quick overview of the presentation, we're going to talk about peace actions, systems, and peace building. We're going to talk about the movement that we built at Virginia Tech, belonging, youth-led change, culture, and how that influences peace behavior. We're going to talk about my specific peace research and that of my colleagues. We're going to talk about peace and systems and how that looks like structural violence, structural peace, and then how that shows up in terms of implicit biases that we all hold. We're also going to move towards the future. What does it look like to build peace, and how can we do all that together? In terms of peace actions, we've got to start with what was the catalyst for me with April 16th, 2007 at Virginia Tech. And so we'll start with a short video that I hope you'll be able to hear. If you can't, then just add a chat mark for me.
You're strong and brave and innocent and unafraid. We're better than we think. And not quite what we want to be. We will prevail. We will prevail. We will prevail. We are Virginia Tech. We are alive to the imagination and the possibility. We will continue to invent the future.
I remember the day like it was yesterday. And I will tell you, in that moment, I was a high school student in Arlington, Virginia at Yorktown High School. And I remember walking down the hallway and someone telling me about what had happened and how little information we had at the time. And I had really good friends that were at Virginia Tech that were freshmen at the time. I remember trying to call over and over again and not being able to get my friend. And fortunately, my friend and many others were okay. But I came to know so many family members, so many survivors who have both dedicated their lives to figuring out how to prevent school violence, but also who were devastatingly impacted by the event on that day. And I think for me, growing up in Arlington in a upper middle class white household, I didn't have a lot of experience with injustice. And for me, this was a catalyst of what felt to be so wrong, so unjust. I don't think I would use injustice at that time, but for me, it was the catalyst of a long journey towards trying to do peace building and creating a more just environment. And so at Virginia Tech, we had a simple idea. We thought about how painful and how much suffering there is in the world. And honestly, we could spend years, we could spend our whole life thinking about what's wrong with these systems, what's wrong with certain people. But we flipped the paradigm and we said, what if we recognize people for the kindness that they're already doing? That people are already being kind. They're doing things different than what's the norm, but we don't talk about that. We don't thank them. We don't recognize. So we took these green actively caring wristbands and we gave out 2,000 of these wristbands across our Virginia Tech campus in the aftermath of the tragedy. We asked someone once they received it to pass it on to another person and then told them to pass it on to somebody else. And sooner or later, 2,000 wristbands spread. It became over 100,000, and these wristbands were passed across the globe. And we had individuals share their story on our website, activelycaring.org, where individuals would talk about what it was like to give or receive a wristband. And this simple idea of recognizing kindness, we felt like was missing from what the world ultimately needed. And we went out to set out on creating that idea in schools. And part of why we did that, and we've got to talk about that story, is because at the end of the day, we are all seeking to belong. All of us are trying to find how we can be both an individual, but how we can fit in with a group. And it's hard. When we think about things like bullying and gossip and exclusion and mental health, it's all related to this idea of, do I feel like I belong? And what I will say is that it was the lack of belonging that was the beginning of why, and I know guys get a bad rap, but it was 5 guys who came together who said, how can we spread a movement of actively caring? How can we create more kindness and recognition for kindness in our culture? And we had this idea that James Baldwin said so many decades before, the place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. And that part of our movement and our journey was about creating a place where we felt like we could belong, where the kindness, the values that we felt like we had were not appreciated, are not the norm. And we're going to have to go out there and make that the norm if that's the world we want to see. And because I was fortunate to do that work of spreading these wristbands and starting a movement on our campus that spread throughout, it also helped open our eyes to what else we could do and how we could help beyond just moments of tangible kindness and caring. And so we decided to run for office. That's my friend Brandon and Joey and Morgan. And we were elected into the student government. And so I spent a year as the vice president of the student government, where we had the opportunity to institutionalize policy and student-centric change. And that's really where I started to understand how students could be so powerful in creating change at their school. One of the things that we did when we ran our political campaign is we were really frustrated with how politics, just like our political climate right now in Washington, D.C., is so much about who has power and who exercises power for themselves and not for others. we had a simple idea. What if our entire SGA, student government campaign, was called SGA for You? And we stood on the drill field every day for 2 weeks during the campaign, and we asked students, what are the most important issues that you care about? We had a huge whiteboard that was 12 feet wide, and we had 4 different categories that students could vote on. And we asked them to make a little tally on that whiteboard. We set up a website that had Facebook Connect, which doesn't seem like a cool idea now, but back in the day, it was the 7th website in the US where you could actually log in with your Facebook account and you could vote through Facebook on what issues were important. And so we ran our entire campaign on the idea of listening to the voices of students, listening to the voices of those we don't normally hear. And students said that their most important issue that they wanted to see was improved transportation. And so we spent an entire year developing a bus tracking app where you could follow the bus and see where it is. Things that are common pretty much now, but in 2009, were pretty much ahead of their time. And as we did more of this work, it came to then me working with my good friend Deepu, who was the graduate student representative to the Virginia Tech Board of Visitors when I was the undergraduate rep. And what that basically meant is that at every university that's public, the governor selects trustees from across the state that represent and oversee the universities. And so I was the undergraduate rep and Deepu was the graduate rep. And what we did for the first time was graduate and undergraduate rep came together and we developed a unified plan around diversity, engagement, and inclusion that we wanted to see embedded into the culture of Virginia Tech. And we amplified those student voices, we amplified those stories and made sure that when policy decisions were being made, that they understood that as a unified voice, graduate and undergraduate students wanted to see intentional efforts in these areas. And so I bring this up to say that what started for me in this journey of feeling resentment and anger about injustice, but also being promotive and thinking about kindness and how we need to lean in to the good that is already happening, then recognizing that it's not just little acts of kindness, but it's also policy change. And that ultimately led me to this moment of where I am, of doing youth-led change. And because I had the opportunity, as you all are creating for so many other folks as well, to be youth leaders early, you are going to have opportunities that other folks will not have to be able to set the vision for your school, your campus culture, eventually organizations and broader systems as well. And so I think you're providing an incredible opportunity to do that. I want to share a few lessons that I learned from being in schools, implementing our programs across different places, and share a few stories as well. One of the most important stories and lessons that I learned in the work that we did about spreading peace and care is that it looks different in different places. And part of our challenge is to figure out what are the things that ultimately are similar about people and how can we group them together to create and build power? And what are the things that are different about people and how can we harness those differences and appreciate the differences that everybody does and brings? And culture is about understanding where there are similarities, where there are things that we should be thinking about, but there are different cultures where we have differences. And there's different ways in which we can think about culture. Obviously, we can think about it in terms of ethnic culture, geographic culture. We can think about our own backgrounds in terms of how class creates different culture. We can think about our school culture, our peer culture. We can think about our family as its own unique culture of expectations and symbols and virtues and rituals that we have. But ultimately, I want to talk about school culture because what we learned in this work is that when you all are implementing programs and training and you are trying to get out these ideas of creating peace and change, one of the things that we have to do is we've really got to spend energy thinking about how it is that we get to a place where we recognize that every culture is different. So here's the story. I remember going into a school and we had this incredible program intervention. And the goal was to have students look out for kindness that other students were doing. They would write stories on a note card. And then in that story, teachers would read those kindness, those kind acts, share those wristbands with other students. And we would hear story after story about a student who was ultimately writing stories about passing pencils, giving a pencil to another student. And I remember being so frustrated and thinking, man, we do this great program. It's awesome. It's all about actively caring. Why are students, middle school students, writing about sharing pencils? It seems so small. It seems so unimportant. Here's the thing. The school rule was that you had to have a pencil to be able to do your classwork. And so sharing a pencil with somebody was actually the most kind act that another student could possibly do. And so the important thing here is that often we as outsiders believe what is good, what is bad, what's caring, what's harmful, but often we don't know unless we sit ourselves within that situation, within that culture. In terms of the peace research that we have done, we have simply asked the question, what is the opposite of peace? And I won't go into too much details with the time that we have, but what we know is that there is peace promotion and there's violence prevention, and that care is the opposite of harm, that peace is the opposite of violence, and that there's a whole host of other opposites that are important too. I want you all to think about your mindset. Do you think of yourself as someone who believes that a better culture is about promoting positives or about reducing problems? Are you someone who wants to focus on promoting peace or on preventing violence? Sometimes they're the same side or different sides of the same coin. You've got the peace promotive side and the violence preventive side, and that these are mindsets that each of us has that affects how we go about creating change. Peace is an action. It's a state of being. It can be organizationally infused in policies. It can be politically driven, and it's also the opposite of violence. In terms of peace and systems, I want to talk about the fact that poverty kills far more people than all the wars in history, more people than all the murderers in history, more than all the suicides in history. Not only does structural violence kill more people than all the behavioral violence put together, but structural violence is also the main cause of behavioral violence. Behavioral violence meaning things like murder, assault, literally doing behaviors to other individuals that could kill and that harms in severe ways. Structural violence are the conditions. They're the factors that lead to violent behavior. There are a host of risk factors in environments, and we can think of many different types. There are protectors that are in environments, things like positive things that we do. When we give people social support, when we thank them, when we do kindness towards them, when we give them leadership roles. These are ways in which we can build protectors in our environment. We have assets, things like character, things like resilience, ways in which people can focus on positivity, hope, and optimism. But ultimately, there are structures in our environment, and I want us to think about the 1968 march related and led by the Poor People's Campaign. America is at a crossroads of history, and it is critically important for us as a nation and society to choose a new path and move upon it with a resolution and courage. In this age of technological wizardry and political immorality, the poor are demanding that the basic needs of people be met as the first priority of our domestic program. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. This was a quote in 1968 where the Reverend talked about the age of technology, our political immorality, and yet we are not meeting the basic needs of so many people in our own country, but more broadly across the globe. And if we want to be peace promoters, we've got to spend energy focused on the factors that lead to the lack of peace and that lead to violence, poverty being one of those major ones. The Poor People's Campaign has been reinvigorated in the last few years, and they're actually doing a virtual march on Washington in a few weeks. So I hope you look out to think about how you might participate on that. I'm going to skip through some of the bias thing. In terms of peace building, I want to talk about our organization and what we've done. When I was a kid and I was in third grade, I loved James Bond. I thought guns were really cool. I loved action movies. I mean, I wouldn't say I was violent, but I would say that there were aspects of our culture that I certainly just took for granted and thought were cool. And it was reading a book, A Long Way Gone, about a child soldier from Sierra Leone that started to shift that framework for me a little bit about the downsides of violence. And that was part of that transition, right from high school to college, where awareness started to open, where reading a little more than what was required in school started to change how I thought about things. And what I can say along this peace building vision is who creates change matters. Peace can come with some self-serving motives. You can start by wanting to be someone who is a leader. Over time, I don't define myself as a leader because I think that there's too much toxicity and negativity even associated with the idea of power seeking to be a leader. As MLK says, we need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice, not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. And I think our goal is to figure out how we find more of these leaders, but also how we understand that not everybody comes to that place immediately, that it takes time, it takes relationships, it takes care. Who creates change is also about representation. Peace can come through moments of representation when we realign power so that there's more opportunity, more voice, and more opportunities for justice for everyone. And so when we come back to this idea of who creates change, it's us. It's every single one of you that's already doing that work and that's committed to figuring out how you will build a place where you can better belong and where others like you can better belong. And when that happens, we'll be closer to a peaceful and a more equitable culture. And so the question is, what level will you build peace at? Is it inner peace? Will you spend more energy meditating? Will you spend more energy being less reactive to your family and friends? Will you think about your own social network and how you can spread peace on social media? Will you do some videos to talk about that? Will you be authentic and real? We're living in this weird culture where we just aren't honest. And if I'm honest, I'm not the most actively caring person all the time, but I'm trying to get better at it. I care about getting better at it. And starting from that place is really the place that we all have got to start at. That there's not good and bad and harmful and caring. There are people who are trying to work towards care and do less harm, and there are people who are fine with staying where they are. And our goal is to help people grow, I think, and move towards a place where they can make influence all the way to some of those cultural norms to build a peace economy and a peace culture. So I know we're getting close to the end. I'm just going to go to a few last slides about what we do as an organization, promote care and prevent harm. 3 quick things. We have a movement right now in South Texas. South Texas, where I lived for the past 2 years on the border, has the highest rate of poverty, diabetes, lack of healthcare access. 40% of women on the border have no healthcare insurance at all. So if they were to get COVID-19, they would be stuck with a bill for tens of thousands of dollars if they ultimately did even survive that. About 40-50% of the folks in South Texas have at least one of those pre-existing conditions that is a risk for COVID-19 death. So me and 6 other members of our team in South Texas are doing this work of trying to call into the community, do social media campaigns to bring awareness to the idea of how we can contain the contagion in South Texas. Our organization also builds leadership development programs. We've done work to address implicit bias with healthcare providers, with school resource officers in schools. We've worked with students on creating youth-led change in their school environment. We've consulted with a host of organizations that are going about creating change in different ways. We have to teach leaders how to think about when to create change. And this model right here is really about 10 years worth of work of integrating across research, literature, and our experience to come at this basic idea that the timing of when we create change matters. And as we think about this pandemic and the work that we've got to do, we have a 3-phase movement. We've got our contain the contagion movement, our respond to the contagion movement, and then our recover from the contagion movement. And that each of these phases have different strategies that are best equipped. So being kind to someone's always a good thing to do across all of these strategies. But helping somebody who's going through a tough time who lost someone, maybe as a result of COVID-19, that kind of kindness and recovery is going to be very different than just looking out for kindness and giving a wristband to someone who does something nice. And so it's kind of helping folks think about when we help and what that looks like. We also have to help folks think about promoting and preventing in different goals. So it's not just enough for us to be promotive about safety and preventive about COVID-19. We've got to be peace promoters and violence preventers, connection promoters and loneliness preventers, wellness promoters, and illness preventers as well. If you look at March for Our Lives, they have put together a peace plan for a safer America that I think will intersect really nicely with some of the aspirations that you all have. And we've been talking with them about how we can work together to build a broader vision of this peace culture that we all want to see. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're launching a COVID-19 safety corps. And we're asking high school and college students in select places, Northern Virginia as being one of those select places, where you'd get trained on promotion and prevention science, leadership, and how to develop social media campaigns, help support the contain, the respond, and the recover from the contagion movement, and also be more equipped to implement social media campaigns to influence your peers in your community, but also eventually in the school when you all go back in the fall to make sure that students are feeling supported. So y'all can go to that link. It's on our website, and I'm sure y'all can share that out as well. It's our website, promotecarepreventharm.org/safety corps. And it's a combination of work we've done, but we're also partnering with a student-led marketing agency at Virginia Tech of college students who know how to do social media campaign development. So it's really exciting that we'll get that launched, and you can look at our website for details about that coming up soon. To me, a few final slides, and that is to say that in order to heal a life, we must do more than address external issues. So it is with a country as well. We can't just address symptoms, we must also address causes. That means addressing the risk factors, the protective factors, the assets. It means addressing the factors, the conditions that lead to less peace and more violence. That's not just the job of a president and our politicians, it's the job of each of us. And so ultimately, our vision as an organization is to move closer to what Marianne Williamson articulated in her vision when she ran for president, which is to build a U.S. Department of Peace that has the type of notoriety, the type of respect, a cabinet position where there would be a Secretary of Peace, just as there is a Secretary of Defense. So we can promote peace in our U.S. culture as well as doing the work of preventing harm. A few final book recommendations that might be useful: The Anatomy of Peace, Nonviolent Communication, and A Politics of Love. And I do want to give some time for folks to be able to ask some questions and have some dialogue. But I'm very grateful for the chance to share some things. There's obviously so much more I would love to say, but for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane, for that paradigm-shifting presentation. That was so thought-provoking and insightful, and I'm sure all of us learned something new today and something to take with us for the future. So we're going to open up the Q&A, so if you have a question, just type in the chat and Shane will answer them accordingly.
So while people are typing in the chat, I would just say with those books, The Anatomy of Peace is really helpful to figure out your own grounding of what peace looks like. Nonviolent Communication is really nice to think about, what are my needs? What are the needs of others? I know we're all very stressed in this time, and it can help us really identify what is the need that I'm trying to fulfill? What's the need I'm fulfilling to someone else when I communicate? Incredible book. And then A Politics of Love centers this idea that Marianne and many others have talked about of a U.S. Department of Peace, a peace economy, the inequities that are in our environment. The book could have easily have been A Politics of Peace. So hopefully we'll think about that. And I would just add another important concept of just saying that at the end of the day, I have always wondered, as I think about this idea of peace and politics, people are kind of resistant. I'm not political. I'm not into politics. Politics is how we distribute resources for people. And so to be a peace promoter, you're going to have to figure out where you fall in creating policies of peace as well as doing actions of peace. And that's what I would say there. So I'm seeing some great comments come in. Let me see if I can address some of these. Wow, these are great. Okay. First one, in today's political climate, we're seeing a heightened degree of polarization based on opposing views, inhibiting the cultivation of peace. How can youth move forward with this situation? Great question, Brittany. One thing I would say is it's really hard. It's hard to love people who are different than us. It's hard to include people who often exclude us. But part of the challenge that we have as peace builders is to include both the marginalized and those who we disagree with. And so my biggest challenge, and I'm sure I know some of you follow me on social media, you can see that I struggle with that on a daily basis. But I'm also very clear to call out the difference between being politically in disagreement. So there are liberals and conservatives ideologically. There are people who see the world differently politically. And both of those worldviews are kind of the yin and the yang, and they have value in balancing out our society. What we don't have right now is that yin and the yang. What we have is concentration of power of certain people. We have corruption. We have individuals who do not care about all people. And we have to know when to push back. We have to know what peace looks like. And sometimes we can be angry in our expression, but are actually still being nonviolent and peaceful. And I would certainly suggest that folks spend more time looking to the past. I think there are folks that are way better positioned. If you look at the struggle with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and look at kind of their worldviews, you might have some insights. A movie that I love, I Am Not Your Negro. It's an incredible story of James Baldwin's writing where he conceptualizes these activists and their work in the civil rights era. And I think it might give you some insight about how we might be able to do some of that better, but also recognize that we all have different strategies for how we might do that. Great question. In your experience as a leader and serving in office, how do you suggest is the best way of acting as a friend or mentor to large groups of people and hearing everyone's opinion, but also calling the shots? Oh, wow, Lisa, great question. That's a really hard thing to do. I've been trying to figure that out for 13 years. I'm still figuring that out. Let me start by saying that it all starts with a relationship. In order for your behavior to be perceived the way that you want, in order for your behavior to be perceived as supportive and as in line with the values that we all share and organizationally, it's really, really important that there is investment earlier in relationships with everybody on your team, so that when things get stressful, when things could be misperceived, when there are points of conflict, you can go back to the fact that we share the same values. We care about the same things. We do trust and we do care about each other. And so unfortunately what happens, and this moment of COVID-19 is a perfect example, if you haven't built great relationships within your team and with other folks as well, and now there's a crisis and you do need an assertive leader to call the shots, you might have some conflict. You might have people who drop out. And some of that might be okay too. People come into things at different times. I will tell you in my own journey that the people that started some of this work with me are not still with me. Some of them are, some of them are not. Some of the folks that I brought in at different times went on to do their own thing and build peace in a different way. And so I bring all that to say is we all have different ways in which we go about creating change. And we all have to recognize that there are different lanes, there are different strategies, and all of those things have value. But I would ultimately say that there's a balancing act between decisions that are made by one individual, a decision that's made by the group. Not easy to do. We actually have some training, interestingly enough, about that exact idea, especially with youth, because we have seen groups that we've worked with completely collapse and fall apart because they didn't set good roles, good expectations, and really what it is good power sharing. Power sharing was the focus of my dissertation about how power and caring relate. And so we have to be mindful of how we intersect power and everything that we do. I can answer that in a much more detailed, nuanced way, but I will keep going with that for now, and I can certainly add more thoughts about that later. What do we do when our voices are silenced? When we try to make a change, but we're constantly hearing, you don't know what you're saying, you're a child. Great question, great point. Two things I would say. One, the reason why I'm a scientist and the reason why I started to lean into science very early is because science gave me credibility, even as a young person, to be able to say, yeah, I don't know everything, but I do know that this really smart person said this, and this really smart person said that, and that smart person said that. And those three ideas are behind what we're trying to do. So when we first passed out those green wristbands, people were like, green wristbands? How is that going to create kindness? How is that going to make the world better? Or whatever. And some people joked, other people thought it was great. And then in spending 13 years now studying the science behind it, what we ultimately were doing, and if you think about it right now in the context of COVID-19, we were creating a caring contagion. We were actually seeing, just like the virus spreads from person to person, we were actually seeing a network create around kindness and having people visually be able to actually see that change. And so I bring that up because having read, looking at history, being able to point to other people will help get some credibility in what you're ultimately doing. And so for those folks of you that are bored, find some books that you can read. Maybe you all could start a book club. I'm in 3 different book clubs, one with public health folks, one with folks that care about social justice, another group that's my own team. And that allows me to hear different perspectives, to also read down different trains. And I really, really suggest that sooner rather than later, that you spend your own energy trying to figure out who can back up what you're trying to say. Because one of the things I will tell you is that new ideas, innovative ideas, creative ideas are not actually new. People who study creativity basically find that what creativity is the connection between ideas that haven't been brought together. So as you think about the ideas that you all are creating, trying to figure out what's already been done versus what hasn't been done and how they intersect, that's where value, that's where creativity creates change. I do think that this is a very painful, lifelong journey, a journey of anger, of resentment, of depression, and then eventually moving to a place of acceptance and of peace. Everyone I know who has been a mentor to me that is a leader on these issues around social justice, none of them have ever gone from knowing how big these problems are to peace. They have spent years, if not decades, trying to figure out their own place in this journey. And you'll see from me that I am still coping with degrees of anger, degrees of depression about the state of our environment, and ultimately still an incredible amount of hope about what we can all create if we help bring more people to the team. For people who are interested in incorporating peace building into their daily life, what are some practices that you recommend? I will come up with some resources that I can share, that I can give in more detail. But there are lots of things that you can do. If you do not meditate right now, really trying to start daily meditation, not for your own well-being, but literally because it is a form of compassion. Taking a moment to do other-centric meditation, which is also analogous to prayer, and being able to take a moment and say, I'm not just grateful for things in my life, but I want to send thoughts, prayer, gratitude to other people every day, is a moment of other awareness that ultimately we all need. I think peace also looks different for each people, right? We all cope in life differently. So for some people, literally exercise every day could be a form of peace. What I will say sooner rather than later is to figure out your routine. I wake up every day and I literally block off hour by hour of what I plan to do in the day. Not because I love structure, because I don't. I'm a very creative, abstract type of thinker. It's actually because creating that structure allows me to be more present when I get to that moment in time. It allows me to go deeper into a conversation with a friend and say, I've got an hour and a half to just go deep on what this person needs right now. But when that hour and a half over, that's when I've got to turn back to my work. And part of the anxiety that we all feel is we've got a mesh in our mind of all these things we feel like we've got to do that are all important and that are all overwhelming. But pausing and saying, what's important today? What's not important? And prioritizing what's important today for myself and for others, and letting those other things be things that you do on a different day. And figuring out your own process. I can send a few resources to help with that. I know we're about at time, so I might read, let me just pick a few that might relate. I see a few on COVID-19, so I'd like to do that. I agree that it's important to promote peace because there is more you can do in that way rather than trying to prevent harm that we may not be able to control. Well, during COVID-19, where is a good place to start? So here's the thing I want to say about COVID-19. I know I said at the beginning, but I really want to say this again. In life, time is very dimensional, meaning that you have hours, you have minutes. 1 minute backwards is the same as 1 minute forward. It's all very similar. If we're all experiencing what I saw in the chat earlier this morning is that time feels very different right now. And time will continue to feel different for quite a long period of time. What I want to say about COVID-19 is this. The moment that we are in right now will be the most defining moment of most people's lives. They don't know it yet, but it will be. We will know a time that was pre-COVID-19, and we will know a time that was after COVID-19. And while it's going to be more complicated than that, I really want everyone to understand that right now, that this will be the most transformative moment, the next 7 to 8, and probably the next 2 or 3 years of the entire direction of our country, the entire direction of our world economy, of our economy, and of the type of care and support that we give to people in our environment. We've got a long way to go to build the culture that we all want to build, but what you're doing right now is literally one of the most important things that anyone could be doing, because people right now are still in panic and are still in that freeze mode of being in a state of trauma. But when folks actually recognize that they are in a state of collective trauma, that's when we're going to start to have some more significant challenges. Unfortunately, things like suicide, things like violence, economic despair. And I think for you all to think about what can you do right now for your peers so that over the summer they feel supported? What can you do when school comes back in the fall? My feeling would be, I don't know, I can't speak for what's happening, but a lot of places will not start back up in August and September. A lot of places will be virtual for a while. A lot of things depend on what ultimately happens. But even if we do go back, think about what's going to happen. For our Asian American students, the type of harassment, the biases that so many students will end up sharing, the fact that some students will want to wear a mask in class and others will not, the fact that some people will want to keep distance, others will not. Some kids will choose to be homeschooled, and some parents will choose that, some will not. Some parents will vaccinate their kids, some may not. There are a host of incredibly stressful things that are going to happen. And I will end by making this bigger point, that in this moment where we are all affected by COVID-19, everyone's health, everyone's safety, everyone's wellness is as important as yours. And the problem that we have with our culture is that it is built on the idea that everyone as an individual can do things alone. Everybody as an individual can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and that is a myth. If there's anything that has become clear, is that for us to build a better culture, we have to work collectively. We've got to come together, and we've got to create more space for more conversation, more dialogue, and more inclusion around these topics. I will download the chat and I will respond to that over the weekend so that can get out to everybody. And I am happy to make myself available. I have a lot of folks, unfortunately to you all, fortunately for me, that I already mentor and support and so forth, that are feeling very overwhelmed. And so that's, unfortunately, as I set my own boundaries for compassion, a little boundary that I'm creating. But I am looking forward to spending more time with your organization to think about how you all can help support the broader folks on this call and the many countless that you all work with. And hopefully even some of you may work with us over the summer if the safety core is something that fits your summer vision and direction. So thank you very much for the time. I know I was going to go over. Luckily, it wasn't too bad, hopefully. But I'm very appreciative of the time to be with you all, and deeply grateful for what you all are doing. I don't think that you understand how ahead of your time and how critically important the work you are doing at the most transformative moment in the history of our country. So thank you.
Thank you guys so much. And we'll make sure to send out a recap email this evening. And Dr. McCarty, if it's okay with you, do you mind sharing your Instagram and your email information with the rest?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can send that out. Absolutely.
Perfect. And we'll also, is it okay if we can also share your PowerPoint slide as well?
Of course.
So yeah, we'll get that to you guys, and also the questions. And we're so grateful to have you guys with us. We really appreciate your time. And I think this concludes our first Lead Talks.